November 1927, Fifth Avenue, New York City. A wrecking crew arrives at the corner of 57th Street. Their target is the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan, 130 rooms, an entire city block. The former home of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore who built America's railroad empire. The mansion had stood for 45 years. A French Renaissance chateau transplanted to American soil. Limestone walls, carved stone details, interiors dripping with gold leaf and marble. The kind of house that announced wealth so loudly you could hear it from blocks away. Now it was coming down. Not because of fire, not because of structural failure, because nobody wanted it anymore, because the family could not afford the $30,000 annual tax bill, because the world that built such houses had ended. The Gilded Age began in the 1870s when industrial fortunes created a new class of American aristocrats. Railroad magnates, steel barons, oil monopolists, men who built palaces on Fifth Avenue to rival European royalty, men who threw parties costing hundreds of thousands, who collected art, married their daughters to European nobles, and lived lives of opulence most Americans could barely imagine. By the 1920s, it was over. The mansions were being demolished for department stores and apartment buildings. The fortunes were being taxed. The social system that sustained it all collapsed under the weight of war, progressive reform, and changing American values. This is the story of how the Gilded Age ended. Not with a single event, but with decades of pressure from labor movements, journalists, politicians, and economic reality. A world built on inequality could not survive when the people at the bottom decided they had had enough. Chapter 1. The Men Who Built Everything. The Civil War ended in April 1865. Victory brought a new question. What kind of country would America become? The answer arrived on rails. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, controlled the New York Central by the 1870s, connecting New York City to Chicago. His system moved freight and passengers more efficiently than smaller competitors. When he died in 1877, his fortune exceeded $100 million, the largest American fortune up to that point. Andrew Carnegie shifted from transportation to steel production, building massive mills around Pittsburgh and controlling every step of the process, from iron ore mines to rail lines to shipping. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. He negotiated secret deals for preferential shipping rates, undercut competitors until they went bankrupt, and built a monopoly that controlled roughly 90% of American refining. At his peak, Rockefeller's wealth was the equivalent of over $400 billion in today's dollars, the richest American in history. These men created unprecedented concentrations of wealth in an environment with almost no regulation. No income tax until 1913, no antitrust laws until 1890, no labor laws, no workplace safety requirements, no limits on working hours. The top 1% owned more than the bottom 90% combined. The wealthy lived in palaces. The poor lived in tenements without plumbing or heat. And those palaces needed somewhere to be built. Fifth Avenue in New York City became the place. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Decided Who Mattered. Money alone did not make you part of Gilded Age high society. The Vanderbilts learned that the hard way. Despite owning railroads and wielding enormous economic power, old New York families considered them nouveau riche, new money, common. The person who controlled access was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. By the 1870s, she had decided that someone needed to define New York's elite. Too many new millionaires were appearing. She appointed herself gatekeeper. Together with her advisor Ward McAllister, she created the concept of the 400. New York's inner circle consisted of exactly 400 people. Her approval granted access. Her disapproval meant permanent exclusion. The Vanderbilts struggled for years until William's wife Alva forced the issue. In 1883, Alva threw a costume ball so elaborate, so expensive, so magnificently excessive that Caroline could not ignore it. The ball cost over $200,000. 1,200 guests in elaborate costumes. It was a statement. The Vanderbilts had arrived. Whether Caroline liked it or not, she attended. During her peak years, roughly 1875 to 1900, she wielded power that money alone could not buy. She decided who mattered. And the wealthy families building mansions on Fifth Avenue all sought her approval. Chapter 3. The Palaces of Fifth Avenue. In 1870, Fifth Avenue above 50th Street was mostly empty. 20 years later, it had become the most expensive residential real estate in America. Block after block of limestone mansions, French chateaux, Italian Renaissance palaces, each one larger and more elaborate than the next. Richard Morris Hunt, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, became the architect of choice. He designed the Vanderbilt Mansion at 52nd Street in 1883. French Gothic, gray limestone, steep roofs, carved ornament everywhere. $3 million to build, another $2 million to furnish. Andrew Carnegie built his palace between 90th and 91st Streets in 1899. He called it simple. It still cost over $1 million and occupied an entire block front. Senator William Andrews Clark built perhaps the most excessive of all. 121 rooms, 4 art galleries, multiple ballrooms. $7 million, 7 years to complete. Each house needed 20 to 40 servants minimum. Butler, housekeeper, cook, footmen, maids, chauffeurs, grooms. Property taxes climbed constantly. Heating costs in winter were enormous. For 2 decades, roughly 1885 to 1905, the building continued. Fifth Avenue became a canyon of wealth. Nobody building these houses in the 1890s imagined that within 30 years most would be demolished. Nobody thought the system could collapse. But forces were already building that would destroy everything they had created. If you want to understand what brought the whole structure down, stay with us, because the collapse came from every direction at once, and it was decades in the making. Chapter 4. The journalists who changed everything. The wealthy thought they controlled their image. They owned newspapers, they sponsored charities, they built libraries and museums with their names on them. They assumed public gratitude for their generosity. Then the journalists arrived, and everything changed. The term muckraker came from Theodore Roosevelt. He borrowed it from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, referring to a character who raked muck instead of looking up to heaven. Roosevelt meant it as criticism. The muckrakers took it as a compliment. Yes, they raked muck, because American society had a lot of muck that needed raking. In 1902, McClure's magazine published 3 groundbreaking series simultaneously. Lincoln Steffens exposed urban political corruption in The Shame of the Cities. Ray Stannard Baker investigated labor conditions and racial inequality, and Ida Tarbell began her devastating series on Standard Oil. Tarbell spent years researching John D. Rockefeller's business practices. She interviewed former Standard Oil employees. She obtained confidential documents. She traced the company's history from its founding through its rise to monopoly power. What she revealed shocked readers. Rockefeller had not built Standard Oil through superior products or service. He had used ruthless tactics, secret deals with railroads for preferential shipping rates, predatory pricing to drive competitors bankrupt, industrial espionage, bribery, threats. The company systematically destroyed anyone who challenged it. The series ran from 1902 to 1904. It was published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, which became a bestseller. Suddenly, Rockefeller was not a captain of industry. He was a robber baron. His wealth was not admirable achievement. It was stolen goods. Rockefeller pointed to his philanthropy, the Library. Ares, the universities, the medical research. The public was not buying it. As one critic put it, Rockefeller was giving away with one hand what he had stolen with the other. Other muckrakers followed. Upton Sinclair investigated the meatpacking industry. His novel, The Jungle, published in 1906, exposed horrific conditions in Chicago stockyards. Spoiled meat sold to consumers, workers losing fingers in machinery. The public was horrified. President Roosevelt, after reading it, ordered investigations. The Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act both passed in 1906 directly due to the book's impact. David Graham Phillips attacked political corruption. His series, The Treason of the Senate, showed how wealthy industrialists controlled senators through bribery and influence. He named names, Documented payments showed the corruption mechanisms clearly. Public opinion shifted dramatically. In 1880, most Americans admired wealthy industrialists. By 1910, many viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. The muckrakers had destroyed the moral authority of Gilded Age fortunes. They had shown that wealth came from exploitation, that monopolies harmed the public, that the system was rigged. You could not go back from that knowledge. Chapter 5. The workers who refused. The workers had been patient. Decades of patience, accepting poverty wages, enduring dangerous conditions, watching fortunes accumulate at the top while they struggled to feed their families. But patience has limits. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 started in West Virginia when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut wages. Workers walked off. The strike spread nationwide. In Pittsburgh, militiamen fired into crowds, killing 20. Federal troops restored order after 45 days. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was worse. Carnegie's steel plant in Pennsylvania. Workers struck over wage cuts. Henry Clay Frick hired 300 Pinkerton detectives. A 12-hour gun battle followed when they arrived by barge. 10 died. The state militia broke the strike. The workers lost. But Carnegie's reputation suffered permanent damage. He had been in Scotland during the strike, claiming ignorance. Nobody believed him. The man who preached the gospel of wealth had ordered armed guards to shoot striking workers. These strikes revealed something important. The Gilded Age depended on cheap labor. If those workers refused, the whole system stopped. This gave labor unexpected power. Not enough to win most strikes, but enough to show that the fortunes at the top depended on continued cooperation from people who had been exploited. The biggest change came in 1913. Congress passed the 16th Amendment, creating a federal income tax. For the first time, the government could tax wealth directly. The principle terrified the wealthy. If the government could tax income, it could tax wealth, and the rates would only rise. By 1918, the highest bracket paid 77%. The days of accumulating unlimited untaxed wealth were over. Chapter 6. The War That Broke the World. August 1914. Europe erupted into war, and even from across the Atlantic, the conflict destroyed the world that had created the Gilded Age. It killed European aristocracy, literally. Young British lords enlisted as officers and died in the trenches. French nobility lost sons at Verdun. German princes fell at the Somme. That aristocracy had been the model American millionaires aspired to. The Fifth Avenue mansions were built to resemble European palaces. American daughters married British lords to gain titles. Now that aristocracy was dying in Belgian mud, the sons of dukes lived in trenches infested with rats. None of it, the glamour, the centuries of refinement, protected them from machine guns and artillery. Titles meant nothing when shells were falling. When America entered the conflict in April 1917, women entered factories by the millions. They proved they could do the work. They gained economic independence. When the war ended, many refused to return to previous subservience. Young women who had been maids discovered factory work paid better and offered freedom. The shortage of household help became acute. Families who had easily employed 30 or 40 people before the conflict struggled to find 10. Without adequate staff, the mansions deteriorated. A 50-room palace required full staffing, or it fell apart. The Russian Revolution of 1917 terrified American elites. The Tsar overthrown, aristocracy murdered, property seized. If it could happen in Russia, could it happen here? Extreme inequality, wealthy elites out of touch, workers pushed to breaking points. Russia had exploded. America might be next. The foundation had cracked. The structure was unstable, and soon it would start coming down. Chapter 7. When the heirs could not afford it. Cornelius Vanderbilt III inherited his grandfather's mansion in 1926. He did not want it. 130 rooms, the largest private residence in Manhattan. It cost $30,000 annually in property taxes alone. Add heating, maintenance, insurance, and minimum staff, and carrying costs exceeded $250,000 yearly. He could not afford it. Nobody could. His grandfather had lived during an era of no income tax. By 1926, the top bracket was 25%. The servant situation was equally impossible. After the war, factories paid better and offered freedom. Fewer people were willing to work as live-in help. Cornelius looked at the numbers and made a rational decision. Sell. The house went to Bergdorf Goodman for $7 million. Within months, it was demolished. He was not alone. Carnegie's widow sold his mansion in 1926. The house was barely 27 years old, built to last centuries, gone in less than 3 decades. The Astor mansions came down. The Clark Palace, $7 million and 7 years to build, torn down in 1927. What took years to build took days to destroy. In 1890, Fifth Avenue was lined with mansions. By 1930, most were gone. 40 years from construction to demolition. What replaced them told its own story. Department stores, office buildings, apartment houses, commercial enterprises open to anyone with money to spend. Public access replaced private privilege. The mansions that survived did so by transforming. Henry Clay Frick had always planned to leave his mansion to the public. The Frick Collection opened in 1935. Anyone could walk through rooms that had once been completely private. The Morgan Library became a public institution, after J.P. Morgan's son donated it in 1924. The rare books, manuscripts, and artworks Morgan had collected were made accessible to scholars and visitors. In Newport, Rhode Island, the great cottages survived because they were vacation homes, not year-round residences. Today, tourists visit the Breakers and Marble House. They walk through rooms that once hosted society balls. They see the opulence firsthand. But these survivors were exceptions. For every mansion that was repurposed, 10 were demolished. The majority of Gilded Age architecture simply vanished. The Vanderbilt Mansion is now Bergdorf Goodman. Where the Astor houses stood is now commercial real estate. The physical evidence of the Gilded Age mostly disappeared. The buildings that announced wealth so loudly were silenced. What the wrecking balls destroyed was more than limestone and marble. They demolished a social system, an economic structure, a way of life that had seemed unshakable but proved remarkably fragile. The men who built it thought their fortunes were permanent. They were wrong. The workers they underpaid organized and demanded more. The journalists they ignored exposed their methods. The taxes they avoided were finally imposed. The wars they watched from afar destroyed the aristocratic model they had imitated. And in the end, their children could not afford the houses they had built. The Gilded Age ended not with a revolution, not with a catastrophe, but with a wrecking crew arriving at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street on a November morning in 1927, and the slow, grinding realization that the world had moved on. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. Every week we go back into the moments that built the modern world and find the version nobody told you about. The next one is already waiting.